So by the 1530s, Cromwell has already begun to instigate change for the church. He's the architect of the break from Rome, and he begins that within 1529 with the divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So 1530s, some of the things that Cromwell does, the main thing that I want to take a look at is we're going to have a look at the dissolution of the monasteries. So the dissolution of monasteries occurs in two different phases. Although Wolsey has dissolved 29 monasteries when he's in power, Wolsey uses that for his own kind of personal gain. Cromwell is the person that introduces the two acts for the dissolution of the monasteries. The first in 1536, which is the dissolution of the smaller monasteries with an income of under £200 a year. The remainder were to be dissolved in 1539 under the Act of the Dissolution of Greater Monasteries, with the final house, called Waltham Abbey, finally closing in March 15. So, monasteries have been important for multiple reasons. When we're thinking, for example, about motives for the dissolution of the monasteries, as well as why people didn't like it, it's really important to consider what the role of a monastery was in the first place. So probably the primary role of a monastery is for prayer. Remember that monasteries have to be able to pray for the salvation of souls. Another place in which prayers can be said for the salvation of souls is in the chantries. So the Catholic doctrine of purgatory is inextricably bound to the existence of monasteries to pray for the souls. Also, hospitality. People who are going on pilgrimage, for example, can stay in a monastery. They can pay a small fee to be able to stay over. Monasteries are supposed to be places of protection, of sanctuary, for people who need it. So sanctuary, although rarely used, this can be used as a safe place for those who are in fear of their life. One example of sanctuary that I can think of is the Stafford Lavelle Rebellion, when the Humphrey brothers decide that they're going to seek sanctuary. So in that one, the Stafford brothers, including Humphrey Stafford, wants to be able to seek safety in a sanctuary. So that's under Henry VII. So education. Monastery is also important for education, to be able to educate local people, and monks are responsible for copying manuscripts for everything, really. For religious books, for medical books. They're the only people, in most cases, within local areas that are actually educated. They can read, they can write. Charity, being able to give alms or charity to the poor and caring for sick people in the absence of hospital. So when the monasteries are dissolved, it becomes a huge, huge problem. So like I said at the beginning, dissolving the monasteries is not a new idea. Wolsey had done it in 1529, prior to 1529, to be able to fund wars for Henry, and also to be able to fund his own personal pocket. So, dissolution of the monasteries takes place in two phases under Cromwell. 1536, the Act on the Dissolution of Smaller Monasteries, and the Act on the Dissolution of Larger Monasteries in 1539, which ends with Waltham Abbey in 1540. So, main motives of the dissolution of monasteries. In 1535, a census, or the Valor Ecclesiasticus of the church's wealth, is carried out. At the same time, Cromwell sends out inspectors to be able to look at the standards and behaviours within the monastery. These inspections are carried out really quickly, but they provide Cromwell with the evidence that he needed. Now, we could suggest that Cromwell is essentially making up evidence to be able to dissolve the monasteries, to be able to then push forward with the break from Rome. However, there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that in fact the monasteries were decayed. But remember that largely at this point, people are pretty happy with the Catholic Church still. Even though Henry is going about his Reformation, people rely upon the monasteries. Local example, would be Louth Park Abbey. When they closed Louth Park Abbey, that does end up leading to the Lincolnshire Rising, part of the Pilgrimage of Grace. So the evidence that Cromwell collects is needed to make it easier to be able to convince Parliament of the necessity to close down the smaller houses that he portrays as decayed. But the act that closed the smaller monasteries also praised the larger houses. So it could be argued that at this stage there's no plan to be able to close all monasteries. But within 4 years, all monasteries are closed. Most had already surrendered voluntarily, with abbots often receiving large pensions in return. The second act of dissolution only confirms the voluntary surrender, but at the same time, another one is also passed that promises the wealth from the dissolution would be used to establish colleges and new bishoprics, as well as bring about other social benefits. Therefore, when MPs are voting for the second act, many might have believed they were just voting for the funds transferred to other uses and not to the Crown. Over 500 religious houses ended up being dissolved. Crown income was doubled, and the resale value of monastic land is estimated to be 1.3 million. Now, it isn't just those kind of financial motives or even, for example, religious motives. So yes, 1.3 million from the sale of the land. However, much of that land ends up becoming Crown land, which Henry can then redistribute to people to be able to gain their loyalty. A prime example of that would be the Duke of Norfolk, who, even though he is a devout Catholic, has been one of the people that has, or does go on to, for example, trying to force factions upon Henry, like with the marriage of Catherine Howard. He will willingly accept that land and forget about his devout Catholic religion in response to be able to gain land. So, motives for the dissolution. Potentially, something like this could be an essay within an exam. If they were going to ask you about dissolution, I would expect them to be able to ask you something about the motives for the dissolution. So, for example, I would go for things like religious and also financial. You could also go for things like loyalty. It helps to be able to gain loyalty for Henry. So, for religious. Traditional accounts have argued that the main reason for the dissolution is the behaviour of the monks. However, for many people that does appear to be exaggerated. Cromwell needed to be able to persuade Parliament of the need for the dissolution. As many people valued not just the religious, but also the social work done by monasteries. So Cromwell needed to be able to create a strong argument to justify to Parliament why he needed to get rid of them. Monasteries also uphold traditional religious beliefs in purgatory and offered prayer for the dead. Protestants don't believe in that. Monasteries have already been dissolved in places like Germany and Scandinavia, and have also been criticised by writers such as Erasmus. So it isn't uncommon for them to actually want to be able to gain or get rid of monasteries in that period. As well, many monks are also opponents of change. Monasteries owe allegiance to the main house of their order, which is usually outside of England. That conflicts with the idea of the Act and Restraint of Appeals that England is therefore supreme, so therefore you cannot go to other people. Okay? The Act and Restraint of Appeals is all about stopping people appealing to the Pope, but also appealing to other religious houses outside of England. It also would have been noticed that for many, opponents of the change of the Reformation were monks. So while other monks, for example, also later become involved in the Pilgrimage of Grace, Henry and Cromwell are keen to be able to nip that in the bud. You've also got financial motives. So Cromwell has promised to be able to make Henry the richest man in Christendom. This is a major consideration for Henry because he'd already spent his inheritance from Henry VII on war against France. And financial security is really important for Henry because by the 1530s, England is under threat of invasion from the Catholic Crusade following the break from Rome. Now this then grows when Henry is excommunicated, and Francis I and Charles V signed a peace treaty in 1538. Many of the larger monasteries have net incomes of over £1,000 per year, so this money is often used to build fortifications on the south coast. He needed to be able to protect himself from Catholic crusades. The funds would also remove the need for Henry to ask for parliamentary taxation. This would be popular and might help him to be able to gain support of those people who had opposed religious change. Cromwell's chief aim, for example, could have been to be able to endow the crown in perpetuity. So to be able to provide the monarchy with political stability by dissolving the monasteries is the exact thing that Henry would want to do More money equals more political stability. The dissolution also provides Henry with a large amount of land. So like I said a minute ago, the land could then be sold to build up crown income, or it can be used as patronage or reward for loyalty. Henry is able to buy off potential opposition to his religious changes by offering land in return for support. For example, the Duke of Norfolk, who puts his greed before his religious beliefs. Now, despite the use of land as bribes, it's still thought necessary to introduce a bill in 1539 promising a range of benefits from the dissolution. But very few of those benefits were actually seen. So they do build some new cathedral grammar schools in Canterbury and Chester, and some colleges, but most of the gains go to the king and the ruling elites. Many of the monks do find jobs as priests, but most of the monks are left in significant levels of poverty. Much of the money that is gained by the crown through the sales of land is spent on warfare, but it had retained about half the lands by Henry's death. And it was usually the wealthy who had gained from that dissolution. So if you had a question on the motives for the dissolution, I would go religion, financial, and loyalty or power. Dissolving the monasteries allows, for example, in this religious one here, where we've said that they uphold traditional beliefs, and also we said a minute ago about how they also have to report to another order, that could then work in Henry's favour. It's able to give Henry more power by ensuring that they're gone, so therefore he can be in charge instead. Now, not everybody likes what's gone on. So this then leads to the Pilgrimage of Grace. So the Pilgrimage of Grace is 3 separate uprisings. First of all, your Lincolnshire Rising, then the Pilgrimage of Grace, the Bigod Revolt and the Cumberland Rising. Begin in 1536 and then end in 1537. Begins to spread. Oh, actually, sorry, I thought about this on. So first of all, what I was going to say is, why do people actually rebel? So if we're thinking about reasons for the rebellion of the Pilgrimage of Grace, it's not just religious motives. Religious motives is a key one because people relied upon the monasteries for everything. They relied upon them to uphold Catholic belief, for example, in purgatory. They relied upon them for aid, for healthcare, for everything. But if we're thinking about why they rebel, it is not just religious reasons. So, further evidence actually that it is religious reasons is one of the things that they carry in the rebellion. The flag at the very, very front is known as the Banner of the 5 Wounds of Christ, and they march under that. So that's a religious flag, religious significance to suggest that that is their main purpose. But the rebels do have some other complaints. So, for example, there had been a poor harvest in 1535 to 1536. Enclosure has also been an issue around York and the Lake District, and they complain about rents and entry fines. They dislike having taxation in peacetime, particularly in 1534 when they are charged an additional subsidy even though Henry is not going to war. And there's also complaints about Cromwell and other advisors. So, for example, in the case of the Louth Rising or the Lincolnshire Rising, there's rumours that Cromwell and the other advisors, when they're coming round to the monasteries and the churches, are stealing church jewels for themselves. And there's also anger about the exclusion of Mary from succession. So, let's take a look at the Pilgrimage of Grace. Lincolnshire Rising. The pilgrimage begins in Lincolnshire at Louth and it spreads across the county to Yorkshire. Government commissioners are present in the county, and this it's their job to be able to go around and dissolve smaller monasteries, in this case Louth Park Abbey. They're also there to be able to collect the subsidy and to be able to inspect the clergy and enforce religious changes. But there are rumours that they are going to seize church plates and jewels. So that suggests that the dissolution isn't just the main reason for that uprising. Grievances that are also drawn up at Lincoln also share that view as well. Now this rising includes both gentry and commoners. But the news of the rising quickly begins to spread to Yorkshire. and that's when it leads to the Pilgrimage of Grace. So, as a result of the Lincolnshire Rebellion, it begins to spread north to Yorkshire. It's led by a lawyer called Robert Aske, and in Westmoreland, a rebel army is established when the priest did not announce the forthcoming holy day. In Craven, the rebels rose to be able to defend Sawley Abbey from being dissolved. The rebels are then able to seize York, and then Lord Darcy hands over Pontefract Castle. So Pontefract Castle is seen as the gateway to the south. Once they have that, they've then got access to get to the south of England. Now the size of the rebel hosts is far larger than the army that Henry sends north to be able to negotiate, so therefore he plays for time. He sends the Duke of Norfolk up to be able to negotiate them, and he asks the rebels for their demands, which are drawn up at Pontefract and given to Norfolk. Henry then offers them a general pardon, and they say that they will stop dissolving the monasteries until Parliament, or won't dissolve the monasteries until Parliament have met again. This essentially is a truce between the rebels, between Robert Aske and between Henry. So they meet that agreement, and the rebels very quickly disperse. However, some of the former rebels are then suspicious of what's gone on. So this leads to another rebellion in early January 1537. This collapses very quickly, and Bigod is arrested in Cumberland, where another group had started to attack Carlisle. This gave Henry the excuse that he needed. So many, including gentry and the nobles, are rounded up and executed, including Aske and Darcy, with the death toll reaching 178. So, let's think about how serious this rebellion is. So, is the rebellion a threat? This bit. So, look at the rebellion as a whole. Now, the rebel forces had outnumbered those of the king. They did take control of the major city in York. They took control of Pontefract Castle, the gateway of the south. They were pretty well organised under the leadership of Robert Aske, and they managed to attract support from all classes. However, it ultimately doesn't get to London. That's kind of the main bit of this. It doesn't end up reaching London. Aske does claim that the dissolution is the greatest cause of the rising, and the rebels do restore some monks of their monastery. However, they don't really do anything. Henry has still dissolved all monasteries by 1540. In fact, it gives Henry almost a bit of a catalyst, because some of the very first areas that Henry then decides he wants to get rid of the monasteries in is those who have been actively involved within the rebellion itself. So, potential questions to be able to think about with this topic. Motives for the dissolution of the monasteries, definitely get that. This could also be evidence, for example, in questions asking about Henry's Reformation. How successful was it? I think a horrible question would be, for example, something about, is the Pilgrimage of Grace also a threat?